Okay, so this week we are discussing poetic narratives, so narratives that are not prose, they're poetry. So there's a difference between the two, so we've been focusing on prose narratives up until this point, but this week we're going to zero in on what poetic narratives look like and how we examine them. So your chapter that you read had a lot of information about poetry, and oftentimes it can be difficult to sort of break down all of the terms and remember all the terms and the ways that we refer to different parts of the poem. So I want to take some time to go through this, but certainly if you've not read the chapter, make sure that you go back and do so, as that explains a lot more than what I'm able to explain here, and there are a lot more examples that help to solidify the things that we're going to be talking about. So when we look at poetry, it's important, first of all, not to abandon the title, as you shouldn't for any text, but certainly with poetry, a lot of times we can read poetry titles as poem titles as a sort of mini thesis or introduction to the poem or what the poem is going to be speaking about. So sometimes poets will play with the title to sort of trick us into thinking that it's about one thing, or to leave the sort of content of the poem ambiguous, so they'll play with the title in that way. But a lot of times we can get an idea of what the poem will be about through the title. So stanzas are the blocks of lines that the poem is broken up into. So there's actually different terms for stanzas of the number of lines that comprise stanzas that your book discusses. So that's something I would encourage you to look at. Essentially, when we think about the number of lines, so a couplet is 2 lines, a triplet or tercet is 3 lines, a quatrain is 4 lines. So we're just thinking about the number of lines in a stanza. Lines themselves are the rows of words in a poem, and it's important to note too that lines are not determined by the margins of the paper, or editors. They're determined by the poet themselves, thinking about the length of the line and how they want the line to be structured. So when a line ends in punctuation, we will say that it is end stopped or end blocked. When lines do not end in punctuation, so when there's an idea that's broken up or a phrase that's broken up, carrying over from one line to another, that's called enjambment. And then caesura is punctuation that occurs in the middle of the line, and usually it's for emphasis, so there's some sort of stressing of an idea or phrase that's happening, which is part of why the punctuation is being used in that way. Another thing that's important to note is the perspective or point of view of the poem. So who is telling it? Who does the speaker seem to be? Is it sort of a first person? Is it sort of like third person omniscient perspective? Or is the poem told by a sort of persona? So does the author seem to have developed a sort of persona for the speaker of their poem? So an example would be the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. We have this character that sort of developed, J. Alfred Prufrock, that is a persona that T.S. Eliot has developed. Other things that are important to note with poetry are the rhyming and the sounds and the way that that is constructed in the poem. So sometimes it's kind of referred to like the soundscape of a poem. So rhyming, of course, are the syllables in a line that repeat in various patterns and create a sort of musicality. But the rhyme scheme refers to the structure of those rhymes, and specifically end rhymes. So the rhyming that occurs at the end of each line. Internal rhyming is rhyming that happens within a line. So the rhyme scheme isn't dependent on the internal rhyming, just the end rhymes. Near or slant rhymes are rhymes that are sort of slightly different in their sound, but still are close enough to sort of convey that musicality, to sort of have that rhyming effect. So sometimes, you'll see poets that do deal with only strict rhymes, and others that are a little bit looser with their rhymes, so not as strict, using near and slant rhymes. In terms of other words that we use to identify sound, so alliteration is repetition of common consonants at the beginning of words. consonants, like giggling gophers is a good example of that. Assonance is the repetition of identical vowel sounds, and consonance is a sort of opposite repetition of similar or identical consonant sounds. Then we also have onomatopoeia, so words that mimic the sound they're describing. So buzz is a good example. The way that the sort of zzz of buzz conveys the actual buzzing idea is a good example of onomatopoeia. It's also really important for us to think about the atmosphere and imagery of poems and how those are conveyed. So oftentimes that's through description, but also through things like the rhyming and the soundscape. Meter is something that's important to discuss when we're thinking about poetry. So meter is the rhythmical patterns that make up each line of a poem. And it hinges on the syntax of the poem, or basically the way that the poem is put together, the way that the lines are put together. Syllabic meter refers to poems that have lines devoted to a certain number of syllables. So that's a sort of strict number of syllables per line. And then accentual meter is based on pronunciation of each word, and it affects the cadence of the line. So if you have a strict sort of accentual meter, then all of the accents in your lines are going to follow a pattern. Stressed and unstressed syllables are basically where we place emphasis when we speak. So the stressed syllables are the ones that we place emphasis on. Unstressed are the ones that are lacking emphasis or accentuation when we speak. And then a metrical foot is just any combination of stressed and unstressed syllables in a line of poetry. And there are different words for different types of metrical feet. So when we think about those different types of feet, so an I am is a metrical foot of 2 syllables, and it follows an unstressed stressed pattern, like today. So the to part, or the to part, when we pronounce that, is not stressed, and day is stressed. So it is an I am, unstressed, stressed, and 2 syllables. Trochee is also 2 syllables, and it follows a stressed, unstressed pattern, so this sort of opposite. So playing, play being the stressed word, and ing being the unstressed, syllable, yeah. So play being the stressed syllable, ing being the unstressed syllable. Spondee is also 2 syllables, and that follows a stressed, stressed pattern. So homemade, both of those words, or both of those syllables rather, are accented or stressed. Pyrrhic is a metrical foot that has, again, 2 syllables, but it's unstressed, unstressed. So in this case, green shade. They're both unstressed syllables. And then there are words that refer to groups of 3 syllables. So an anapest is 3 syllables. It's unstressed, unstressed, stressed. So interrupt is a good example of that. Interrupt. We sort of stress the last part. Dactyl is again 3 syllables, and it's a stressed, unstressed, stressed. So dinosaur. Dinosaur. We have the stressed syllable and then 2 unstressed syllables. So these are important to note as we're thinking about the different metrical feet and how they're appearing, and whether or not there's patterns there. So a lot of times we'll see iambic tetrameter or iambic pentameter. This is a common sort of metrical foot that's used, but then when we have free verse, if we wanted to, we could go through and actually scan to mark the different feet and see where the different feet exist and how we would identify them. So we might have something that's largely iambic, but perhaps has a few spondees or trochees in there, or maybe even an anapest. So this is, once we know these things, then we can go through and actually scan and see the structure of the way that the meter works. So with syllables and stresses, when we're reading, when we're scanning, it's important to take note of syllables and stresses in a poetic line. So when a poem's lines follow both patterns in syllables and in stresses, its rhythm is called an accentual syllabic meter. And we can identify the stressed and unstressed syllables and the number of feet per line, and that's part of how we determine the sort of meter structure of the poems. So some examples here. This is also in your book. Some that appeal. Oh, this automatically corrected. This should be trimeter, not trimester. It looks like the autocorrect corrected it. But 4 feet per line, tetrameter, pentameter, these are common things. Trimeter is also something that you might see. And then the ones, those are sort of the more common ones, but then certain types of poems or certain, when poets play with structure, they might use other numbers of feet per line. Scansion. So scansion is when we're actually reading for metrical distinctions, so counting the number of syllables, identifying the metrical structures, the feet that exist, and so forth. So thinking about where the accents and stresses are, and how the feet are actually structured. So when a poem doesn't adhere to a sort of strict structure, or to a traditional accentual syllabic meter pattern, then we call that metrical variance. So if we look at this here, this is actually from An Irish Airman Foresees His Death. So if we read it, we can actually break down the stressed and unstressed syllables. I've already broken it down here so you can see where the feet are. So this is what we would call tetrameter, because we have 4 feet. And let's just read this first line. So, I know that I shall meet my fate. Actually, let's just read it all. I know that I shall meet my fate somewhere among the clouds above. Those that I fight, I do not hate. Those that I guard, I do not love. So you can hear when I read it that there's a sort of musicality to this. And this is because this is in iambic tetrameter. So we have unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed. So if we went through and we could actually go through and mark all of the different syllables for the stressed, unstressed, and then see how the structure fits. But in this case, the sort of musicality, the rhythm of it has to do with the rhyme scheme here, right? So we have an A-B rhyme scheme, and also with the consistent structure, consistent iambic tetrameter. So when we're reading poems, this is something that we can do. So beyond just thinking about, the symbols and the imagery and so forth, it's important for us to think about the structure itself and how that contributes to the meaning of the poem. So I want to go through and talk about the poets that you are reading for this week and their poetry. I'll give you a little bit of background about the poets, and then also talk a little bit about some of the things that we should take into account with the works that are chosen for this week. So W.B. Yeats is this guy right here. So he lived from 1865 to 1939. And something that's sort of interesting about him is he's interested in spiritualism and the paranormal, and so he incorporated that as part of his poetry. But something that's more relevant for this poem that we're reading is that he supported the Irish independence movement. So at the time that he was writing, there was a push for Irish independence from Great Britain. And with the war, with World War I, the Irish that were fighting for the sort of British cause or under the British flag felt alienated from that, and in some ways frustrated by that. So that's something that we can read in this particular poem, and in some ways this poem can be viewed as a social commentary because of our speaker's sort of stance on why he's flying and how he feels about it. Emily Dickinson over here lived from 1830 to 1886, so she was a very reclusive, private person, and she wasn't known to go out of her house very much. And really a lot of her poetry was found and published after her death. And some of the things that she often meditated on were things like death and the sort of quality of being alone. So her life, I think we can say, also influenced the sort of work that she was doing. So some things that I want to point out with An Irish Airman Foresees His Death. So we already mentioned its iambic tetrameter. It's also a first-person perspective, which contributes to the sort of emotional quality and the mood of the poem. So we're getting this very personal, kind of devastating perspective from the speaker, this Irish airman. The enjambment in the lines, so the way that the lines pause and they don't end on punctuation, that the lines are sort of broke up and they don't have a lot of end stops. That gives us pauses to the poem, the way that that's sort of split up. We also get a sense of the setting being actually the clouds themselves, that he's sort of referring to the clouds as a sort of present setting, which adds to the sort of emotion of the poem. So there's a sort of tone of despair, but also acceptance. There also seems to be acceptance of one's fate that we can read, although that's only one way that we can look at it. When you read it, you might think about how you interpret his perspective and his mood. But we definitely can see a feeling of alienation from the sort of cause and the people that he's fighting for. That's something that seems to be pretty clear within the text. I heard a fly buzz when I died. This is Emily Dickinson's poem. So one thing that we might take note of is the sort of metrical variance of the meter, the number of syllables per line. And if we think about the sort of moment in time, we might identify that as part of that variance, that there's a sort of chaoticness that contributes to the lack of consistency. Dickinson also uses personification and capitalization to stress certain objects and images, and she sort of turns a lot of things into more sort of thinking and feeling things, which is something that she does. So in another one of her poems, I Could Not Stop for Death, He Kindly Stopped for Me, she turns death into a person. So this is something that's pretty consistent with her poetry. We have some onomatopoeia, so buzz, and then the buzz is actually described as a blue, uncertain stumbling, which makes it a personified thing. So if it's stumbling, it has the capacity to stumble, right? It has some sort of personification. But this description, describing it as blue and uncertain, also speaks to the sort of chaotic, like, deterioration of senses. If we can think of this sort of, like, hyper-sensualized experience where not only is the sound something that you hear, but it appears to be blue and appears to be stumbling and uncertain. So that sort of depicts where the speaker is in her process of death. We have a metaphor with the windows being eyes. So she says the speaker says the windows failed, and in this sense we can sort of infer that the windows are the eyes, right? That this cannot see to see means that the speaker's eyes have closed. And then there's a lot of repetition of hyphens and the phrase and then, particularly at the end of the poem, that sort of contribute to our desire to read on, the sort of speed at which this is happening, and so forth. Yeah. So all of these sort of things contribute to how Dickinson is depicting the sort of deteriorating state in the process of death. Our next author is Walt Whitman. So he lived from 1819 to 1892. And poetry was something that was very important to him, and he often reflected on his sort of relationship as the poet and his relationship to his readers, and also the sort of role of the poet in the grand scheme of, like, society and country, and what poetry should do. So he sort of saw poetry as something that should bring people together and to sort of celebrate the life of a country. So with his poetry, he would often write as the sort of voice of common people. So he would seek as much as possible to sort of be the voice for all Americans, and that was his stated goal. And he's considered an American Romantic poet, so that means that he had an appreciation for nature as well, and the sort of recognition of the unification of all things. So unification of people, people with nature, people with other people, people and nature across time. The sort of unity of all things. So with Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, so it's a free verse poem, but Whitman is playing with the meter in the lines, the number of syllables per line, and so forth. He also makes use of repetition of syntax and repetition of ideas. And this sort of helps to build the poem and emphasize ideas, but also sort of give suspense in some ways, and to develop a depth of feeling, hopefully, right, with the reader. So an example, he says, others will enter, others will watch. He has a sort of succession of others will do this, will do this. So this sort of builds into his main idea, and he has several structures like that where he sort of repeats this syntax in order to build up to this bigger idea. So it's a first person's perspective. He's speaking to the river and to the crowds, but also to us as readers, and his goal seems to be to speak across time. So he says, what is it then between us? What is the count of the scores or hundreds of years between us? So not only is he speaking to the crowd and to the river in front of him, but he's thinking about all those that will cross the river after him, those that have crossed before, and the sort of unity of all of those people together, and wanting to speak to all of them and for all of them. So one of the things that we see is this sort of desire to connect with us as readers, and he asks us questions and sort of speaks to us directly, and that's something that we can see. But at the same time, there's also a distance that he's placing between himself and sort of positioning himself as the observer. So when one is an observer, right, one is separate from, there's a sort of necessary separation that has to take place in order for one to observe and not just sort of be a part of. There's a step back that one has to take. So he's sort of taking a step back, but also desiring to get rid of that distance, and not just the distance in the present for him, but also across time. So it's really kind of a lovely idea. Our next poet is William Carlos Williams. So he lived from 1883 to 1963, and he was a practicing doctor actually at the same time that he was writing poetry, and he often wrote poems on the back of prescription pads during his breaks. So he was constantly sort of picking up on things and writing about them. And one of the things that he's known for style-wise is his imagism, which is something, it's a type of poetry that Ezra Pound developed, but that Williams really took and molded and sort of adopted as his own. So he was also interested and inspired by Whitman and the sort of speaking for America, or recognizing America. And that's part of what he tries to do, is sort of create these like everyman poems, or try and convey everyday experiences and sort of show the beauty of them, beauty of certain images that we might sort of pass over without thought. But he's also seeking to distance himself from some of his contemporaries, like Pound and Eliot, whose writing was much less accessible to the sort of common man, largely because of the use of things like allusions to ancient texts, writing in different languages, and these references that he felt like were making the text too academic. That it was, he said that poems should be a pleasure, and he sort of had this idea that they couldn't be a pleasure if they were too difficult for the reader to encounter and to understand. So a lot of his poems focus on sort of quote-unquote American things, so landscapes, objects, and individuals that he observes in his regular life, or that he is familiar with as part of his sort of familiarity with the American landscape. So At the Ball Game is an interesting poem, because on the surface of it, it seems to be the sort of celebration of a crowd, but he actually is both recognizing the sort of beauty of the crowd and its capacity for evil, for hatred, for consuming the individual and becoming just the crowd itself. So it's a free verse poem, and he uses enjambment to sort of split up the lines. And his descriptions are something that we should pay attention to, because he describes the crowd as both alive and venomous, but also beautiful. So he's recognizing the sort of duality of the crowd and its capacity for beauty, but also for venom, for vitriol. So he refers to the crowd as they, recognizing the individuals in the crowd, but he also recognizes the crowd as a unit. So when he calls it alive and venomous, he refers to it as a unit. But this sort of split use of they and it speaks to his recognition of the crowd being made up of individuals, right? The crowd is not just one thing that in which if you're a part of a crowd you lose all sort of free speech or free thinking ideas. And in fact, he seems to be warning us against that, the capacity for us to be swept up by the crowd. By using this they, he recognizes that the crowd is made up of people, individuals, and it doesn't just exist as a unit. He conveys or he sort of likens and juxtaposes the crowd at the ball game with the Inquisition and Revolution, crowds that had the capacity to kill and to enact new ideas, but also to destroy. So sort of likening this crowd at the ball game, which seems to be rather innocuous or harmless, to a crowd that could be much more dangerous. And as a whole, he sort of recognizes the power and danger of a crowd and the power and danger of groupthink. So if we forget that we are individuals, or if we join a crowd against individuals, then we risk sort of giving ourselves over to groupthink. And that can be something that's both beautiful, as he recognizes, but also dangerous, right? So there's a lot of fun in being a part of a crowd and sort of losing yourself. That's the beautiful part, but there's also a danger in that. Our next poet is Langston Hughes. So he lived from 1902 to 1967. He was an American writer and social activist, and in particular he was known for his poetry. One of his more famous works of poetry was the Weary Blues. He was a very recognized figure of the Harlem Renaissance, and he was a leader as part of leader of the Harlem Renaissance, but he also he didn't stay in the U.S. He did a lot of traveling, and he sort of expatriated himself at certain periods of his life in France and England. His poetry has a musicality to it that reflects his interests and his sort of patterning of his poetry off of jazz and blues music. And some of his poetry also reflects his social activist goals. In fact, a lot of it does. We can read that in a lot of it. So with Let America Be America again, so one of the things that we should notice with this poem is that it plays with form. So it starts with this very consistent rhyme scheme and stanzaic structure. It has a sort of consistent rhythm to it, and then it deviates from that. And in between those stanzas are these little asides in parentheses that sort of respond to those stanzas. And he sort of starts with that and then plays with it and deviates, doing different things with the stanzaic structure and the number of lines, the meter, and so forth. But we might argue, or we could interpret that sort of starting with that consistent rhyme scheme and stanzaic structure as being a sort of reference to something like a patriotic song that has a very strict structure and form. So the way that he's using these stanzas sort of mimics that, but then the parenthetical asides speak back to that. And then his shifting away from that speaks back to that sort of patriotic song, that patriotic idea, because he's questioning that, right? Because he's challenging that. So syntax, one of the things that we recognize is the repetition of syntax or certain phrases for emphasis. So he has certain sections or certain stanzas where he's repeating certain syntactical structures, like the I am this, I am that, so I am the poor white, I am the Negro bearing. And that repetition of I am allows the speaker to sort of take on different personas and to bring them together in a way. He also uses repetition to stress certain ideas, like America never was America to me. So it's an idea that's repeated throughout the poem and sort of played with as well. So it's not always strictly America never was America to me, but that idea is repeated throughout the poem. And that's an important part of the poem itself, because that's part of what he's trying to stress, what the speaker is trying to stress. So one of the things that's also interesting, and with that, if we think about music and Langston Hughes' interest in music, we might see the sort of call and response as a sort of musical move as well. So having this sort of strict stanzaic structure and rhyme scheme at the beginning of the poem with the responses in parentheses, sort of acting like a call and response in which the speaker responds to these sort of patriotic ideals that, America never was America for him, and that it doesn't represent the freedom and the opportunity that are sort of touted as part of the American idealization, much like patriotic songs do. So when we think about what he's trying to do here and the way that he structures things, so this seems to be a critique of the sort of idealistic idea that America offers freedom for all and opportunity for all. The speaker is sort of pushing back against that narrative and pointing out that for him, the speaker, that opportunity and that freedom are not extended. So he's sort of pushing back against this idea that America is doing all the things that it was sort of set out to do, right? So offering opportunity and freedom for all, he's sort of pushing back and saying, well, that's not something that I experience, and that's not something that other people experience. So commenting on those sort of idealistic responses and thoughts about America. And in that way, we can read this poem as a social critique. Our next poet is Ezra Pound. So he lived from 1885 to 1972. And he was an expatriate. He lived in France, England, Italy, and other places. So he spent actually very little time in the States and really spent most of his time abroad. And he was a very important icon for the modernist movement, particularly the modernist poetry movement. So he sort of came up with the ideas, invented the forms imagism and vorticism, which other poets adapted and used and responded to. He also had a really important role as a mentor for other writers, and not just poets. He was a mentor for T.S. Eliot, but he was also a mentor for Ernest Hemingway. And for that role that he had, he's sort of considered a literary midwife for the modernist period, as he was helping to sort of more or less give birth to a lot of other modernist writing. He also was an editor for a lot of his friends, so he edited a lot of essays and literary works, but he also did editing on a professional level, and he often helped his friends sort of get set up with editors so their work could get published. So this poem, In a Station of the Metro, is only 2 lines, and actually it was much longer, but he cut it to these 2 lines. These were the lines that he came back to. These are the most important. So it's very imagery-centric. We have this sort of implied metaphor here. So the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. There's sort of an implied are, right? The apparition of these faces in the crowd are petals on a wet black bough. But he gets rid of even the are, because the are is too much. Since it's implied, since we can understand, the are becomes unnecessary. So the poem recognizes the faces of the crowd and likens them to this sort of natural imagery. And we don't know who the speaker and, from what perspective the poem is being spoken. But we could read it as a first-person perspective or a third-person perspective, so sort of a distance perspective, or first-person, somebody sort of stopping in the middle of the crowd and having this sort of salient moment where they recognize the crowd around them and liken them to this sort of natural phenomenon. So we think about Pound's rules for imagism, we can see them at play here as well. So these are the sort of 3 rules that he developed. So short and direct, not using excessive adjectives or sentimentality. So certainly we have wet and black as adjectives. There's not a lot of expression of emotional expression there. Making use of the rhythms of ordinary speech in free verse. So this is indeed in free verse, but there's also some playing with the speech, the sort of musicality of it. So the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. So these three short words being monosyllabic adds a little bit of sort of percussion to our reading of the poem. And then the last rule is a focus on the precision of the image as a key vehicle for the poem's meaning. So getting rid of anything that's distracting or elaborate. And really, even getting rid of the R here, we are forced to focus on these two images and how they connect to one another. So we're getting rid of anything that's distracting, and we're seeing these two images together. And we're left as readers to sort of think about those connections. And how the faces might appear to be petals on a wet black bough, and what that means. Next is Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So he lived from 1772 to 1834. He was an English poet, literary critic, philosopher, and theologian. And he was somebody who was actually recognized for his poetry and his poetic criticism at the time of when he was living, which is different from a lot of the folks that we might encounter. And a lot of his work is really influenced by ideas of the time, being his time in the sort of literary trends being the Romantic period and British Romantic periods, which happened before the American Romantic period. So some of the things that influence that are part of his writing and his sort of ideals are reverence for nature, and an emphasis on emotion and the sort of emotional quality of writing. These are things that we can see in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. So one of the things that we might take note of is the sort of structure. So the syllables per line, the rhyme scheme, this all shifts and changes. So he's not adhering to a very strict structure. But we have a very sort of specific narrative here. And it's a frame story because we have the wedding guest is the speaker of the story, but he meets and encounters this mariner, and then the mariner is telling his story, and that's being conveyed to us through the wedding guest. So just like with Frankenstein, we had a frame story, so we have a frame story here as well. So the wedding guest is listening to the mariner and sort of digesting his tale and responding to it. And he actually... the mariner responds to, and the wedding guest interjects in the story to remind us of the sort of telling nature of the way that this is being told to the wedding guest. So the albatross is a rather famous symbol. So the albatross that is hung around the mariner's neck when he kills it is often sort of interpreted as a symbol for man's hubris and pride. But there are other ways that we can interpret that, and I would encourage you to think about how you might interpret that. The sort of putting of the albatross around his neck. But it's definitely something that we can read as being symbolic for, in one sense at least, in one interpretation for his sort of crimes against nature. Imagery is really important to this narrative, to this poem. So a lot of the imagery is used to convey the mariner's feelings about nature, and also about the things that are happening to him. So at first, we can take note of the way that his approach to the sea nature reflects a sort of abhorrence and a disgust. So he describes the slimy things did crawl with legs upon the slimy sea. So that's slimy being the key adjective there, the key descriptor there, that not being very pleasant. But after he's been sort of saved and the albatross has fallen off his, when he's sort of coming around and recognizing the power of nature, he says, I watched the water snakes, they moved in tracks of shining white, and he recognizes them as beautiful, and that's when he's sort of absolved. The albatross falls off his neck, and his sort of plight as being stranded persists no longer. But it takes him sort of changing perspective from having this sort of negative, prideful view of humanity over nature to one of recognition of the beauty and power of nature for him to be sort of absolved. So the mariner is punished for killing the albatross, so that's one way that we can interpret the text, for his lack of reverence for nature. And for that punishment, he's sort of at the mercy of life and death. We see that the sort of game that happens between death and life and death, where the mariner is won by life and death, and the crew is given to death. So it's sort of implied that this life and death is worse than death, right? If you are dead, you no longer have to deal with the things of life, but the mariner is suffering for his crimes. He's sort of living halfway dead and halfway alive, and that's something that's very painful for him. And part of what we learn from the mariner's telling is that he's compelled to tell his story. That's part of his penitence, is when he sees someone he feels compelled to tell the story to, he must tell the story. And the result is that the wedding guest misses this wedding that he's supposed to be going to, but that he considers his own life, and he's sort of awestruck by the mariner's story and thinks about what it means for his own life as well, what he can learn from it. Okay, and our last poet is T.S. Eliot. So his full name is Thomas Stearns Eliot, and he lived from 1888 to 1965. So he was actually born in the U.S., but like Pound, he was an expatriate. He actually became an English citizen and renounced his American citizenship. So he moved there when he was fairly young, and I can't remember the precise year, but he basically lived most of his life in England. And in many ways, he's thought of as being more British than American in terms of how we classify his writing. So he was someone who was an essayist, a playwright, a poet, a literary critic, and he's often widely recognized, of course, for his poetry. He was also one of the more influential modernist poets, and one of the more sort of academic poets, so a poet who was focused on, he had a lot of allusions, he was really trying to speak to this sort of long-standing poetic tradition, which he felt was very important to writing poetry. And he actually wrote this essay called Tradition and the Individual Talent, where he talks about how poets should strive to celebrate tradition and to sort of rework tradition rather than trying to develop something entirely new. So that's part of why he has so many allusions, which you will see some allusions in Prufrock, as he's trying to sort of build on the literary tradition that exists, and to make it new. And make it new is actually something that Ezra Pound is sort of a phrase that Ezra Pound came up with, but it's definitely something that he and T.S. Eliot both practiced. So with the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, there's a lot of allusions in this poem, so that's something that or in his poetry at large, and several in Prufrock that we should take note of. So if there's something that's confusing to you, or a reference that you are unsure of, I would encourage you to look it up, because that helps you to understand the poem, but also to recognize that this is something that is part of Eliot's style, using allusions. So it is a free verse poem, and it's told from a first-person perspective. And we have a lot of imagery and metaphors, but these are things that contribute to the sort of mood of the poem and the tone of the poem, which is sort of filled with this anxiety as we're following a sort of this interior monologue that J. Alfred Prufrock has. So an example of simile that actually helps us to understand the sort of mood, and which happens very early on in the poem, is when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table. So he's sort of playing with this, right? We have this idea of evening spread out against the sky. That should be something that's beautiful, right? That's lovely. But it's described as a patient, or like a patient etherized upon a table. So immediately this sort of puts a damper on this sort of recognition of beauty. There's an anxiety that's immediately sort of thrust upon us in the beginning of the poem. So throughout the poem, repetition, questions, stress the speaker's sort of anxious thoughts and his anxious state. So we get the sense that there's something that he wants to say to this woman that he's sort of talking to, but he can't bring himself to say it, and it's causing him a lot of stress and anxiety. So we have the repetition of, for example, do I dare and do I dare. So this sort of repetition of anxious thoughts. So if you've ever ruminated on something and you find yourself just sort of thinking the same thing over and over, that's kind of what T.S. Eliot is capturing here. So we sort of follow the speaker through different social situations, but we're only privy to his thoughts. We have this sort of like inner monologue stream of consciousness that we're privy to. We don't get to see very much of the outside perspective other than what Prufrock tells us. So like the women coming and going, speaking of Michelangelo, is something that he observes, and that's actually part of a repetition in the poem, but it's something that's repeated through the text, and we're sort of reading it through Prufrock's perspective. So there's a lot of anxiety and sort of tenseness in this poem that we can feel as readers. Okay, well that's it for now. So I hope that you will enjoy these poems, and I want you to think about how we can see them as sort of fitting into this theme of otherness. So otherness and being an outsider is not always something that is negative, right? Sometimes we need to sort of other ourselves or put ourselves outside of a group in order to sort of take a step back and be analytical or think or recognize the sort of world around us. So I want you to think about how otherness comes into play with these texts that we're reading. All right, have a good week.